A wild bobcat let me touch her babies, something they say should never happen. She first came to me as a starving stray, but the morning she returned, limping through the snow with a newborn bobcat in her mouth, I knew something was terribly wrong. One by one, she brought 6 tiny lives to my door, begging for help in the only way a wild mother could. And what happened next changed everything. The morning began like any other in the Bitterroot Mountains. Quiet, pale light filtering through the pines, a soft chill clinging to the air. David Miller pulled open his cabin door with a steaming mug of coffee in hand, expecting nothing more than the usual stillness of the forest. But standing on his porch, framed by the faint glow of dawn, was Willow, the stray bobcat he had once rescued and released almost a year ago. She had never come this close to him since the day she bounded back into the wild. Now she stood only a few feet away, her sides heaving with exhaustion, her fur damp and clumped with dirt, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity he had never seen in a wild animal. In her mouth hung a tiny bobcat kitten, no bigger than David's forearm. Its little body trembled, paws curled inward, eyes barely open. Willow stepped forward with surprising gentleness and placed the kitten right at David's feet. She didn't snarl, didn't retreat, only stared at him, breathing hard as if waiting for something. David froze, unsure if he should move, speak, or simply let the moment settle. He had seen Willow once or twice over the past months, usually from a distance, a shadow slipping between the trees. But never like this. Never this close. Never this desperate. The kitten made a soft, cracking sound, barely a cry. David knelt slowly, careful not to startle Willow, and saw the frost clinging to the baby's whiskers. He could feel its trembling through the wooden boards of his porch. Willow's ears twitched as she watched his every move, not in warning, but in a silent plea. David had spent decades around wildlife, but nothing in his experience told him how to respond when a wild bobcat mother set her newborn at his doorstep as if she trusted him more than the forest itself. Before he could gather his thoughts, Willow turned abruptly and slipped off the porch, disappearing into the tree line with the silent grace of a ghost. David rose, heart hammering, scanning the woods for any hint of her. The forest was still again. The only sound, the faint wind moving through the branches, and the fragile breaths of the kitten lying helpless on his porch. David gently lifted the baby in both hands, feeling the rapid, frightened heartbeat and the surprising lightness of its body. He hurried inside, wrapping the kitten in an old flannel shirt and setting it by the wood stove. As he adjusted the stove's damper to raise the heat, his mind raced. Willow had never behaved this way before. Wild animals rarely returned to humans after being released, especially predators. And a mother bobcat? She should have been more fiercely protective, more guarded, more wary. Instead, she had delivered her infant into his hands like a last resort. Moments later, as David prepared warm water for the kitten, a flicker of motion outside the cabin window caught his eye. Willow was back, and in her mouth was another kitten. David rushed to the door, but stopped himself just in time. Willow climbed the porch steps slowly, every movement heavy with fatigue, and laid the second kitten beside the empty flannel shirt. She didn't look at David this time. Instead, her gaze drifted toward the dark forest behind her, ears pinned back as though she expected trouble. David whispered, "What happened to you, girl?" Though he knew she couldn't answer in words, but the haunted look in Willow's amber eyes, the dirt crusted around her paws, and the faint limp in her sack leg all spoke of something gone terribly wrong. She stared at the two kittens for a moment, then at David, and with a low, guttural sound, an exhausted rumble rather than a warning, she turned again and vanished into the trees for the second time. David stood in the doorway, stunned by what he had witnessed. The wind carried the scent of wet earth. The sky was turning brighter by the minute, but all he could feel was a growing, insistent question rising inside him. What had driven a wild bobcat mother to bring her babies to his door? And how many more were still out there in the cold, waiting for her to return? David stood in the open doorway, staring into the thinning morning fog as those questions pounded through his mind. The two kittens he had brought inside were warming by the stove, their breathing steadier now, their fragile bodies curled into the flannel like it was their mother's fur. But Willow's frantic behavior, her exhaustion, and the absence of any territorial warning made something inside David tighten with worry. A mother bobcat never behaved this way unless desperation had already taken something from her. Minutes felt like hours as he hovered between the porch and the living room, eyes shifting constantly from the warm glow of the stove to the dark woods Willow had vanished into. He paced, checked the kittens, stepped back out again, then repeated the same cycle, unable to sit still. The forest had always been his refuge, a place he understood better than most people could. Yet right now, the silence of the trees felt like they were holding their breath. Then movement. A faint, low rustling filtered through the brush beyond his porch. David's hands instinctively curled around the railing as Willow emerged again between the pines. In her mouth was another kitten, this one darker, its fur thick with mud, its tail dragging limply. Willow's gait was uneven, each step more labored than the last. She climbed the steps slowly, one paw trembling as she placed the kitten beside the others. Her chest rose and fell in rapid bursts, steam rising from her breath into the cold air. "Easy, girl," David whispered, but Willow didn't linger. She turned sharply, wobbling for a second, before regaining her footing and slipping off the porch again, vanishing into the trees like a shadow swallowed by deeper shadows. David scooped up the third kitten and hurried it inside, adding it to the warming nest. He rubbed its back gently with a dry cloth, coaxing warmth back into the small, shivering body. Another few minutes passed. Then again, the same soft rustling. Willow reappeared, this time carrying a lighter-colored kitten with a faint stripe across the bridge of its nose. She paused at the porch edge as if steadying herself, then delivered the fourth kitten and backed away, panting. David could see it clearly now. She was running on sheer willpower. Something terrible had happened in the night, something that had left her with no choice but to trust him. He didn't dare follow her yet. If he spooked her or appeared too close, she might abandon the task. So he waited, heart thudding in a slow, heavy beat as Willow disappeared once more into the trees. By now the sun had lifted over the ridge, casting pale gold over the frost-slick grass. The air was still bitingly cold, and David knew time was running out for whatever kittens were still out there. The fifth trip took longer, much longer. David stepped to the porch edge, squinting into the distance. The woods seemed to pulse with an unsettling stillness. He started to worry Willow wasn't coming back. Then, almost like an apparition, she emerged again, this time barely able to hold herself upright. Her head hung low, and in her mouth was a kitten so small it could have fit in one of David's hands without stretching from palm to fingertip. The kitten wasn't crying. It wasn't even moving. "No," David whispered, stepping forward. Willow made it to the top step, but faltered, her legs buckling beneath her. The kitten tumbled gently onto the wooden plank. David reached out instinctively, stopping short only because he didn't want to frighten her. Willow steadied herself, lifted her head, and stared at him, an exhausted, hollow gaze that struck him deeper than words ever could. He knelt, picking up the near-lifeless kitten with both hands. Its body was cold, limp. He pressed it to his chest for warmth and rushed it inside, rubbing its tiny limbs with slow, firm motions, whispering encouragement under his breath. The first faint twitch of a paw came after nearly a minute, and David let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He set the kitten with the others, layering another folded blanket over them, their tiny forms nestled together instinctively, sharing whatever warmth their small bodies could create. Willow hadn't returned yet. David checked the porch again. Nothing. He waited, the knot in his chest tightening. Then came the sixth trip, but this time the sound was different. Not the light shuffle of Willow's paws on pine needles, but a heavier stumble, like something dragging itself forward. David rushed outside and found Willow not on the porch, but at the base of the steps. She was lying on her side, one paw extended forward, the sixth kitten tucked beneath her chin. Willow's breathing was ragged, her flank rising and falling in shallow waves. "Oh God, Willow," David murmured, dropping to his knees. She looked up at him, eyes glazed with exhaustion, but still fiercely aware, still pleading. David reached slowly, carefully, and lifted the final kitten, brushing dirt from its face. Willow didn't resist. She didn't even shift. She only watched him with a kind of resigned trust that made his throat tighten. When he rose to carry the kitten inside, Willow tried to push herself up, but her legs gave out. She slipped onto her belly, chest pressed to the ground. David crouched again, meeting her eyes. "I'll take care of them," he said softly. "I swear it." Something flickered in Willow's gaze at the sound of his voice. Relief, maybe, or simply the release of a burden she had carried all night. She lowered her head for a moment, closing her eyes as if gathering the last of her strength. Then she pushed herself upright, wobbling but determined, and backed away from him. She slipped off the steps and disappeared into the brush, tail low, posture unsteady. Inside, David placed the sixth kitten with its siblings. The flannel bundle now pulsed with tiny, shaky breaths, 6 small bodies layered like fallen leaves. He stood over them, hands braced on his knees, the weight of everything sinking in. 6 kittens, all delivered to his door, all barely clinging to warmth. Whatever had driven Willow to trust him, whatever danger had forced her to flee her den, it wasn't over. As David looked toward the dark tree line beyond his window, he felt the first edge of dread creeping in. Something terrible had happened out there. Something violent enough to destroy a bobcat den. Something frightening enough to make a wild mother risk everything to save her young. And now, whatever that danger was, it might be coming closer. The kittens were huddled together near the stove, wrapped in layers of flannel and old towels. Their tiny bodies rose and fell with shallow breaths, warming slowly but still vulnerable. David hovered over them a moment longer, listening to the soft crackle of the fire. He wanted to stay with them, but his instincts wouldn't allow him to ignore the nagging fear at the back of his mind. Willow's panic, her exhaustion, the limp in her step, these were signs of more than just bad weather. He put on his coat, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside. The cold air bit into his skin, sharp and immediate, but the forest carried a stillness that felt wrong. Too quiet, too heavy. Even the birds were silent. The only sound was the crunch of frozen pine needles beneath his boots as he headed toward the direction Willow had repeatedly come from. Branches were bent and broken along the path. Some snapped clean like something heavy had rolled or tumbled over them. David scanned the ground with the flashlight, tracing the impressions in the earth. Deep, irregular marks mixed with smaller paw prints. Willow's tracks were easy to recognize. He saw the stagger in her steps, the places where she had paused, probably to catch her breath. But what made his stomach twist was the smear of dried blood trailing alongside those prints. It wasn't from the kittens. The color and thickness told him it was from an adult. Willow had been hurt more badly than she let on. "Damn it, girl," he muttered, pressing deeper into the woods. He followed the trail for several minutes until the earth dipped toward a shallow ravine. Here, the ground sloped downward, the soil softening into dark mud. The flashlight beam swept across torn grass, scattered leaves, and then something else. A collapsed mound of earth and rocks, piled in a jagged heap at the base of an outcropping. It looked like the ground had given way, sliding down in heavy sheets during the storm. David's breath caught. Willow's den. He slid down the muddy slope, careful not to disturb the debris. The den opening had completely vanished beneath rubble. Stones, clumps of hardened mud, branches. He crouched and brushed aside some of the dirt, exposing a pocket of the former burrow. The smell of cold earth rushed out. The inside was dark, cramped, the bedding half buried. Another smear of blood marked the edge of the entrance. He touched it lightly, fresh enough to have come from her desperate attempts to dig her babies free. "Good God," he whispered, his chest tightening. Willow had clawed her way through this wreckage in the storm, alone, terrified, probably half blind from the rain, retrieving one helpless kitten at a time. 6 of them. It was a miracle she hadn't been crushed herself. David stood, wiping mud from his hands. Storm damage alone didn't feel like the full story. The rocks didn't look like they had fallen naturally. Some of them were jagged, as if forcibly dislodged. And near the bottom of the rubble, half hidden beneath a slab, he noticed an imprint, something wide and flat. A heavy tire track, a vehicle. No storm made that. David scanned the ground again, more carefully this time. Tire marks dug through the mud, leading directly past the destroyed den. Not just any vehicle, an ATV. The same kind people used on hunting trips, or worse, off-trail joyrides without caring what they tore up. His jaw clenched. If someone had come through recklessly, their carelessness could have caused the collapse that nearly killed Willow's entire litter. He felt a cold anger settle in his gut. It wasn't malice, just ignorance. Someone had ridden too close to the den, maybe during the storm, when the ground was unstable. One wrong turn, one careless swerve, and the hillside had come down on top of a mother bobcat and her newborns. David took a slow breath, trying to calm the tightness in his chest. Anger wouldn't help Willow, and it wouldn't help the kittens fighting for warmth back at the cabin. What mattered now was finding out if Willow was still out here somewhere, injured, exhausted, alone, or if she had managed to escape the collapse with nothing left but the strength to save her young. He scanned the forest floor for more blood, more tracks. The sun finally broke fully over the treetops, casting long shadows that cut sharply across the snow-dusted ground. Willow's trail veered toward the creek, where a thin layer of ice had formed overnight. David followed it, heart thudding in his chest. He imagined Willow pushing herself through the woods all night, her injured leg dragging, body cold, breath shallow. A bobcat was tough, But no animal could endure that level of stress without a cost. The trail thinned near the water's edge. One set of paw prints dipped into the ice-crusted mud. Willow must have stopped to drink. David knelt beside the frozen path, touching the edge of the print. The ice hadn't fully hardened. This was recent. She wasn't far. He rose again, sweeping the woods with his gaze. Somewhere beyond the trees, a faint rustle stirred. A shape shifted in the brush, not loud, but enough to draw his attention. He stepped closer, careful, quiet. "Willow?" he called softly. The rustling grew louder, then stopped. David held his breath. A moment later, a shadow appeared between the cedar trunks, low to the ground, moving stiffly. Willow stepped into view, her sides quivering, her fur matted with dried mud. She wasn't carrying a kitten this time, only herself, and she was barely holding it together. Her right shoulder dipped awkwardly. She took 3 steps, stumbled, then caught herself before falling. When she lifted her head, David saw the exhaustion in her eyes. Not fear, not aggression, just a bone-deep weariness. "Come on, girl," he whispered. "Let me help." But she wouldn't come closer. Willow held his gaze for a long, heavy moment, then looked back toward the direction of the den, as if acknowledging what she had lost, or what she had survived. When her eyes returned to David, he could see the flicker of something he recognized. The same trust she'd shown the night he'd rescued her a year ago. Then Willow turned, limped into the thick underbrush, and disappeared. David stayed frozen where he stood, listening to the forest swallow her up. His chest ached with the weight of everything he had seen. The collapsed den, the blood, the frantic trips she had made through the storm. 6 helpless babies carried in her mouth across cold mud and sharp stones. When he finally headed back toward the cabin, the sun was fully up. The light seemed too bright, almost indifferent to the suffering woven into the woods that morning. David tightened his coat against the chill as he walked, his boots leaving fresh impressions beside Willow's fading tracks. There was no question now. Whatever danger Willow had escaped, it wasn't gone. And it wasn't finished. David repeated those words silently as he made his way back to the cabin, each step heavier than the last. The forest around him looked unchanged, quiet, peaceful, bathed in soft winter sunlight. But he could see past the calm veneer now. He knew what lay beneath it. The collapsed den, the streaks of dried blood, the frantic tracks slashed into the mud. Willow had carried 6 newborns through that chaos, mile after mile, and delivered them straight into his hands. No wild bobcat would do such a thing unless she had no other choice left. When David reached the cabin, warmth spilled out into the cold air as he opened the door. The 6 kittens were huddled so closely together that they looked like one trembling ball of fur. He kneeled beside them, brushing a hand gently over the flannel to feel the steady rise and fall of their tiny chests. They were breathing easier now, though their frail bodies still struggled to hold warmth. One of the smallest kittens let out a soft squeak when David touched its back, then curled deeper into the nest. "You're safe," he murmured, though the assurance felt fragile. Safety wasn't something he could promise, not when Willow was still out there. David added more wood to the stove and then sat on the floor beside the kittens, listening. Every now and then he imagined he heard Willow outside, a step, a rustle, a soft sound in the brush, but each time it turned out to be nothing more than the settling of snow on the roof or the creak of aging boards. She had disappeared back into the woods with the last of her strength. He didn't know if she would come back. He didn't know if she could. Still, he left the door cracked open, just enough for a bobcat-sized visitor. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. David lost track. He sat with the kittens, rubbing warmth into their paws, adjusting their blankets, whispering to calm their twitchy breathing. The fire popped softly. Snow began to fall in a whispering curtain outside the window. The forest looked gentler now, softened by white, almost peaceful. But then the faintest scrape against the porch boards. David froze. Another scrape. A low, tired huff. He stood slowly, his heartbeat echoing in his ears as he approached the door. When he stepped outside, the cold wind bit sharply into his skin, but he barely felt it. His eyes were fixed on the figure lying near the steps. Willow. She wasn't standing this time. She was curled against the edge of the porch, sides rising in shallow, uneven breaths. Snow clung to her fur in patches. Her right shoulder was slick with dried mud and something darker beneath it. She lifted her head at the sound of David's boots on the boards. Her eyes, those amber eyes, held his gaze with a frail steadiness. "You came back," he whispered, kneeling down slowly. "Good girl. You came back." Willow didn't move away. She didn't growl. She didn't even flinch when David reached out a cautious hand and let it rest just inches from her front paw. She only breathed, weakly, but no longer alone. Her ears flicked toward the cabin, toward the warmth and the faint mews of her kittens inside. She had brought them all. Her work was done. Now she allowed herself to rest. David glanced at her shoulder and saw the injury more clearly. A gash, probably from rock or debris when the den collapsed. Not bleeding heavily, but raw and painful. Willow must have been pushing through that agony all night. "You should be dead," he murmured, voice cracking. "But you're not. You held on." For a moment, David didn't know what to do. He wasn't allowed to treat a wild adult bobcat directly. Not medically, not with tools, not with sedatives. State regulations were strict. But he could give her warmth, shelter, and space to recover. That wasn't against the law. It was simply compassion. He stood and backed toward the door, opening it wider. Willow's eyes followed the movement. Then, with a trembling push of her front legs, she tried to stand. She faltered immediately. Her legs buckled. David's instinct was to rush to her side, but he held himself still. If he approached too quickly, even in her weakened state, she might panic. "Go ahead," he whispered. "Come inside. Your babies are in there." Willow tried again. This time she managed to stand, though unsteadily. She took a step, then another, each one shakier than the last. When she reached the base of the porch steps, she paused, swaying slightly. David held his breath. At last, Willow climbed onto the porch and crossed the threshold slowly, almost painfully, entering the cabin not as a predator or a wary survivor, but as a mother who had given every ounce of strength she had left. The warmth inside wrapped around her like a blanket. She sniffed the air, caught the scent of her kittens, and her ears shifted forward. When she reached the stove, she lowered herself onto the rug beside the nest. The kittens stirred immediately at her presence, letting out tiny squeaks, crawling blindly toward her warmth. Willow didn't lift her head. She simply opened her front leg enough for the kittens to nestle against her belly. David knelt nearby, careful not to intrude. Watching the 6 newborns press themselves into their mother's fur, he felt something in him loosen, something tight and fearful he hadn't even realized he'd been holding. The bond between them was unmistakable. Fragile, yes. Wounded, yes. But alive. The fire crackled softly. Willow breathed in slow, trembling pulls. The kittens pressed their tiny faces into her chest, comforted by her heartbeat. David watched in silence, feeling the moment settle over him like an old, familiar truth he had forgotten until now. Even the wildest hearts know where to go when they need safety. He remained beside them until Willow's breathing evened, until her eyes drifted closed. Outside the window, snow kept falling, quiet, steady, erasing the tracks in the woods, covering the scars of the night with a blanket of white. But inside the cabin, a different kind of shelter had formed, a fragile circle of trust between a man, a mother, and the 6 tiny lives she had fought through hell to save. For now, they were safe, but David knew the world outside hadn't changed. And he knew, deep in his bones, that whatever had shattered Willow's den was still out there, somewhere in the trees, waiting. The snowfall had grown heavier by the time David stepped onto the porch again, pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders. The air held a strange stillness, the kind that made the forest feel like it was listening. Behind him, Willow and her kittens slept in a fragile pocket of warmth near the stove, unaware of how quickly their safety could be stripped away. David scanned the tree line, eyes narrowed, trying to make sense of the uneasy feeling lodged inside him. The woods were beautiful, but beauty didn't make them harmless. Not today. Not after what he'd seen. David wiped the snow from the railing and stood quietly, listening for anything that didn't belong. He didn't hear predators. No wolves, no coyotes, no ravens calling overhead. Just silence. And silence in the Montana woods rarely meant peace. It meant something was wrong. Something was missing. Something was watching. He moved back inside and shut the door behind him, but the heaviness came with him. Willow stirred at the sound, her ears flicking, eyes cracking open just enough to track his movements. She didn't rise, didn't even lift her head, but the small shift in her posture said everything. The danger hadn't passed. Her instincts were sharper than his. If she was still afraid, then he had every reason to be as well. David crouched beside her and spoke softly. "I won't let anything hurt you. Any of you." It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Not against the unpredictable forces of nature or the careless actions of people, but he made it anyway. Willow blinked slowly, then rested her head beside her kittens again. A sudden pounding at the cabin door shattered the quiet. David's heart lurched. He rose quickly, glancing at Willow to make sure she stayed calm, then approached the door with caution. When he cracked it open, relief washed over him, only to be replaced by a new kind of dread. It was Linda, his gray-haired neighbor from half a mile down the ridge, bundled in a heavy parka and holding a pair of thick gloves. Snow clung to her boots, her hat, and the front of her coat, as if she'd rushed through the storm without a second thought. "David," she said, breathless, "I thought you should know. People in town have been talking." "Talking about what?" he asked, though he had a sick feeling he already knew. "About a bobcat sighting," Linda replied, her voice low. "A big one, with babies." David's stomach tightened. He stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind him, careful to muffle the tiny mews coming from inside. "Where did you hear that?" "At the cafe this morning," she whispered. "Someone said their dog got spooked last night near the creek. One of the hunters saw a bobcat limping across the ridge. They said the animal looked hurt, disoriented." Her eyes flicked toward the trees. Some of them are worried. They're talking about setting traps. David clenched his jaw. She's not a threat to anyone. Linda gave him a knowing look. You and I understand that. But people are nervous. Winter brings out the worst instincts. Fear, impatience, carelessness. And the more they talk, the more likely someone is to act without thinking. He stared down at the fresh snow between them, forcing himself to stay calm. They can't set traps this close to the ridge. It's against regulation. They won't do it legally, Linda replied. All it takes is one person with an ATV and no common sense. Her voice softened. Is Willow here? David didn't answer, but the flicker in his eyes was enough. Linda exhaled through her nose. Then you need to be careful. If she has babies with her, people will panic. They'll think she's unpredictable. She's exhausted, David said quietly. Injured. She's not dangerous. Linda nodded. But they don't know that. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Snowflakes drifted between them, melting on the porch steps. Linda placed a hand on David's arm. You have a good heart, David. But be cautious. Protect her. But protect yourself, too. He nodded. I will. When she turned to leave, her boots crunching through the snow, David watched her disappear down the trail, swallowed by the white curtain of flakes. As soon as she was gone, he slipped back inside and closed the door tightly. Willow had lifted her head again, watching him intently. Her eyes seemed to ask the question she couldn't voice. Is it safe? He dropped to one knee and stroked the rug beside her, careful not to touch her directly. You're okay for now, he murmured. But we don't have much time. He paced the cabin, hands on his hips, mind racing. He couldn't let anyone find out Willow was inside. He couldn't risk someone catching sight of her tracks leading to his home. The kittens were too young to move, too fragile to be relocated now. Willow needed rest, warmth, and protection, and she needed all three immediately. He moved toward the window, peeking through the small gap in the curtains. The fresh snow was already starting to fill in his footprints, smoothing the landscape. But he knew that wouldn't stop a determined hunter or a careless rider from venturing near. David returned to the kittens. One of them lifted its head weakly and squeaked at him, as if sensing his tension. He reached down and stroked the top of its tiny head with the back of one finger. We're going to make this work, he whispered. I won't let anything happen to you. Willow watched him quietly, her breathing evening out, her eyelids slowly lowering again. She trusted him completely, without hesitation, and that trust pressed heavily on his chest. He couldn't fail her, not now, not after everything she had survived. Outside, the snowfall thickened, blurring the outlines of the forest. Tracks vanished beneath fresh powder, sounds softened, the world shrinking to the warm glow of the cabin and the fragile heartbeat of the small family taking shelter within it. But David knew the danger hadn't shrunk with the storm. It had only changed shape. And tomorrow, it would come closer than ever. David barely slept that night. The cabin was warm, the fire steady, the air thick with the soft purring breaths of 6 newborn kittens curled against their mother. But his mind paced faster than his footsteps ever could. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the wind outside, every distant rustle of snow sliding from the roof sharpened his nerves. Willow dozed fitfully, her ears twitching with every sound, her instincts still on high alert despite her exhaustion. The storm eased near dawn, leaving behind a pale stillness that felt unnatural. David stood at the window with a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold, scanning the fresh blanket of snow for tracks. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Prints from an ATV, claw marks, something larger, but all he saw were soft drifts glittering under the early light. Behind him, Willow stirred again. When he turned, she was lifting her head, watching him with wary eyes. Her wound looked no worse, but no better either. She didn't have the strength to defend her family if danger returned. That reality settled like a stone in David's stomach. He leaned down beside her. "We can't stay like this," he said softly. "Not with people talking. Not with traps being set." Willow blinked slowly, as if she understood. David pulled on his boots and stepped outside. The air was sharp, cutting clean through his breath, but he welcomed the cold, anything to revive the clarity he needed. He walked behind the cabin, where the land dipped toward a cluster of old pine trees. Snow coated the branches like thick frosting, muting the crunch of his steps. It was quiet here, too quiet, but the isolation gave him an idea. Years ago, an old storage shed had stood behind the cabin, used by the previous owner to store firewood and small tools. The roof had half collapsed, and the walls sagged inward, but the structure itself was still there. If he could rebuild it, quietly, quickly, it could become a hidden sanctuary for Willow and her kittens. A shelter close enough to protect them, but far enough from the main cabin to avoid drawing unwanted attention. David wasted no time. He returned inside, grabbed a small notebook, and scribbled down rough measurements, materials, and reinforcements he'd need. Willow lifted her head when the door creaked open, her gaze following him as he paced the room. "I'm building you a place," he murmured to her, "somewhere safe." He wasn't sure if she understood, but the soft rumble she made, a tired, low vibration, felt like acknowledgement. The morning passed slowly as David prepared tools, sorted through unused lumber, and gathered anything that could help him work quickly. He had just stepped outside with his arms full of supplies when he saw a familiar shape trudging through the snow-covered trail. Ethan, his longtime friend. A man built like a bear, wrapped in a thick wool coat, snow stuck to his beard and eyebrows. David exhaled, relieved. If anyone could help him build a safe structure fast, it was Ethan. "Morning," Ethan called out, his breath forming a cloud. "You picked a hell of a day to walk up here," David said. "Linda told me what's going on," Ethan replied, stepping onto the porch. "Figured you'd need the help." There was no time for questions, no time for pleasantries. David simply nodded and motioned toward the half-collapsed shed behind the cabin. Ethan followed, surveying the old structure with a critical eye. "This place is a mess," Ethan muttered. "I know. And you need it fixed today." "I do." Ethan rubbed his chin. "All right. We can brace the frame, replace the roof, patch the corners. Won't be pretty, but it'll hold." A wave of relief washed over David. "Thank you." They got to work immediately. The sound of hammers and saws echoed through the trees, softly, carefully, never louder than necessary. David kept glancing back at the cabin every few minutes, watching for movement in the windows. Each time he looked, he saw Willow's ears perked toward the noise, but she didn't rise. She trusted him. That trust pushed him to work faster. By noon, the new frame was up. By mid-afternoon, the roof was solid, reinforced with tar paper and pine boards. Ethan shaped the entryway into a long, narrow den tunnel, just wide enough for a bobcat mother, but too small for anything larger. Inside, they laid old blankets, straw, and insulating wood chips to create warmth without suffocation. From the outside, the structure didn't look like a shed anymore. With its low roofline, natural materials, and careful camouflage of pine branches and dirt, it looked like a natural part of the forest, a hidden sanctuary tucked behind the cabin. As they stood back to admire their work, Ethan wiped sweat from his brow despite the cold. "That should keep her safe," he said, "as long as no one comes snooping." David nodded, though unease pricked at the back of his mind. "We'll keep watch." Ethan's gaze lingered on him. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Word's spreading. People are nervous. One guy down at the lodge, Jack, said he saw fresh tracks near the ridge. Swore it wasn't a bobcat." David tensed. What did he mean by that? Ethan shrugged. "Could be a mountain lion. Could be a wolf, could be nothing. But whatever spooked him, he said it was big." David's heart clenched. If a larger predator had moved into Willow's territory, it would explain the panic she showed last night. It would explain the collapsed den. And it would explain why she had brought her newborns to him instead of relying on the forest she once ruled. When Ethan left before sundown, David hurried inside to check on Willow. She lay curled around her kittens, eyes half open, watching him with a quiet intensity. He crouched next to her, speaking softly. "We built something for you, just for you and your little ones. It's hidden, safe." Willow blinked slowly, her tail curling slightly toward her kits. That evening, as the temperature dropped again, David lifted the smallest kitten gently and felt its warmth radiate onto his palm. Stronger now, breathing steadier. Willow raised her head and touched the kitten's face with her nose before pulling it back to her chest. David stood and looked toward the back door where the new sanctuary waited, hidden among the trees. Snow had begun falling again, blanketing the roof in white. It looked peaceful, but the forest behind it was growing darker by the hour. Night settled over the ridge like a heavy shroud. David stoked the fire, checked the locks, and peered once more through the window at the tree line. Somewhere out there, fresh tracks were being laid in the snow. Tracks belonging to something large enough to frighten hunters, large enough to drive a desperate mother from her home. Whatever it was, David knew it would return. And he wasn't sure if the sanctuary they built today would be enough for tomorrow. The night crept across the Bitterroot Mountains like a slow-moving tide, swallowing the last hints of daylight until the forest was nothing more than a black, breathing shape beyond the cabin walls. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake, one so complete that David found himself checking the windows again and again, just to reassure himself the world outside hadn't vanished entirely. Inside, the fire burned low. Willow slept near the stove, her body curled protectively around her kittens. Their tiny movements, little paws twitching, tiny noses rooting for warmth, were the only signs of life in the dim cabin. David sat nearby, elbows on his knees, watching the embers glow and listening for any sound that didn't belong. He had meant to rest. He had promised Ethan he would try. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the collapsed den, the blood on the rocks, the fresh tire tracks. He saw Willow stumbling through the storm, carrying her babies one by one. He felt the heaviness of danger pressing in from the trees. Somewhere, a predator was moving through this forest, and Willow's family had just become the easiest target. He stayed awake through most of the night, nodding off only when the fire dimmed to a soft glow. And when he finally slipped into a shallow sleep, it lasted barely an hour. A sudden sound jolted him awake, Not a crash, not a howl, something smaller, softer, a whimper. David shot upright. Willow was no longer asleep. She was pacing, limping, around the kittens, her head low, her movements frantic. A soft, sharp sound escaped her throat. A call, a cry, a warning. David blinked hard, trying to gather himself. "What is it, girl?" Willow didn't look at him. She nudged the flannel nest with her nose, then lifted her head and let out a low, urgent sound. David leaned closer, his stomach dropping as soon as he finished counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Only 4 kittens. 2 were missing. He checked again, desperate to believe he was mistaken. But the result was the same. 6 only hours earlier, now just 4. Willow's panic was feral and immediate. She circled the nest, sniffing at the blankets, her ears flattened, her tail stiff. She let out another sharp cry, louder this time, and moved toward the door, limping heavily. The injury in her shoulder pulled sharply with each step, but instinct drove her forward. "Wait!" David said, reaching out to block her path. "Willow, hold on, hold on!" Her eyes burned with desperation. She growled, not at him, but at the door, at the barrier between her and her missing young. It wasn't anger, it was fear, a mother's fear. David's pulse thundered in his ears as he grabbed his jacket and flashlight. "All right, I'm going. I'll find them." Willow hesitated only a second before she pressed her head against the door, urging it open. David cracked it slightly, feeling a gust of cold slap against his face. Snow still fell, but lightly now, flakes drifting lazily to the ground. The night was darker than before, a thick cloud cover hiding the moon. Willow slipped outside before David could stop her. "Willow!" he hissed, rushing after her. She limped across the porch, nose to the ground, sniffing rapidly. Her tail twitched with agitation as she hurried down the steps. David followed, shining the flashlight in a wide arc. The ground was already partially disturbed, paw prints crisscrossing the snow, small and scattered. He saw the prints of the 4 remaining kittens from earlier. But there, just beyond the porch, were 2 sets of smaller tracks leading away from the cabin. They trailed off toward the old pine thicket. "How did they get out?" David muttered under his breath. The drafts, the cracked boards. One of the kittens had climbed out before. They could do it again. Willow caught the scent first. She let out a sharp cry and darted forward, her limp worsening but her pace quick. David kept up, slipping through the snow as they made their way past the cabin's shadow and into the dense brush. The small trail of prints led them deeper into the woods, weaving erratically as if the kittens had been frightened or confused. Branches hung low with snow, brushing David's coat. Willow paused twice, sniffing the air, then pressed on with renewed urgency. "Easy," David whispered, though his own breath was shaky. "We'll find them." Then movement ahead. Willow froze. David raised his flashlight. A small shape trembled at the base of a fallen log. One of the missing kittens, covered in snow and dirt, crying weakly. David hurried forward and scooped it into his hands. The kitten was freezing, its tiny body limp with exhaustion. As he cradled it close to his chest, Willow sniffed it quickly, confirming it was hers, then immediately turned away, nose back to the ground. 1 kitten found, 1 still missing. Willow took the lead again. David followed her through the trees, one arm curled around the trembling kitten. His flashlight beam cut through the dark, searching, scanning every root, every hollow, every indentation in the snow. But the tracks changed here. Instead of the small, scattered paw prints of a frightened kitten, the snow showed a long, dragged line, like something being pulled. A shiver ran through David's spine. "Willow," he whispered. The bobcat mother stood completely still, staring at the trail. Her ears slowly rotated back, pressing against her skull. Her body lowered, tense and trembling, not just from injury, but from recognition. She knew this scent. David knelt and touched the dragged mark. The snow was disturbed, shallow, smeared. No sign of blood, no sign of struggle. But the pattern was clear enough. Something had picked the kitten up. Something larger. And it wasn't Willow. He felt his heartbeat loud in his ears as he followed the trail a few feet farther. It ended at the mouth of an old, rusted drainage pipe half buried beneath fallen branches. A soft sound echoed from inside. A tiny cry. David moved without thinking. He set the first rescued kitten inside his jacket, zipped it gently, and crawled toward the pipe. Willow stayed back, pacing, growling softly, her wounded leg too weak for her to follow. David shined the flashlight into the narrow opening. There, near the far end, was the missing kitten, half submerged in cold mud, shivering violently. It wasn't alone. A stray branch had fallen across it, pinning its hind legs. Mud streaked its tiny body, and its eyes were squeezed shut. David didn't hesitate. He pushed himself into the pipe, the cold metal grazing his jacket, the mud soaking through his knees. When he reached the kitten, he pulled the branch away, cupped the small body in his hands, and whispered, "I've got you. You're safe. I've got you." The kitten barely moved, but it breathed. David backed out of the pipe with both kittens safely in his arms. Willow rushed forward, nose against them, her body shaking with a mixture of relief and terror. David spoke softly. "They're okay. Let's get them inside." He carried the kittens back to the cabin, Willow limping beside him, her tail brushing against his leg as if urging him to move faster. When they reached the porch, David kicked snow off his boots and hurried inside. The fire's warmth washed over him instantly. He placed the kittens into the nest with their siblings, rubbing them gently, willing warmth back into their bodies. Willow curled around all six, her body forming a trembling shield of fur and instinct. She licked each kitten's head, one by one, checking them, counting them, reclaiming them. Only when she was satisfied did she lower her head, eyes heavy with exhaustion. David sank beside her, breathing hard. 2 kittens nearly gone, but all 6 now safe, at least for the moment. As he listened to Willow's ragged breathing blend with the soft mews of her babies, David felt something tighten deep in his chest. The sanctuary was built. The kittens were found. Willow had survived another night. But the dragged tracks in the snow, those didn't belong to the storm, and whatever creature left them would come back, not for Willow, not for the kittens, but for the territory they now shared. David sat beside the fire with his hands pressed to his forehead, breathing slowly, trying to steady the tremor running through his chest. The kittens were safe. Barely. Willow had curled her entire body protectively around them, her breathing sharp but rhythmic as she cleaned each trembling baby in turn. Their small cries had softened into faint squeaks, then into quiet, purr-like vibrations as warmth returned to their tiny bodies. But the image of that dragged line in the snow clung to David's thoughts like a stain. Something had taken interest in the kitten. something confident enough to slink close to his cabin under cover of darkness, something large enough to leave a track that pulled the kitten halfway into the woods before abandoning it near the pipe. A predator didn't abandon easy prey. Whatever had come wasn't hunting. It was warning. The fire crackled softly as David rose, pacing back and forth across the cabin floor. Willow's eyes followed him, tired but alert, the golden glow of the flames reflecting in their weary depths. She knew more of what lurked in these woods than he ever would, and tonight, she had shown him something more painful than fear. She had shown him desperation. Desperation enough to bring her newborns to a human. Desperation enough to try protecting them on a wounded leg. Desperation that now passed between them in silent understanding. David knelt beside her once more and whispered, "I won't let anything happen to them. I promise you that." Willow blinked slowly, then lowered her head to rest atop her kittens, her body curling into a trembling crescent around them. Outside, the wind picked up again. A low moan drifted across the ridge, almost like a distant cry. David stiffened. It wasn't Willow, and it wasn't any sound the kittens could make. He stepped toward the window and peered through the frosted glass. The moon was hidden behind clouds, but the snow reflected enough light to outline the shape of the trees. Nothing moved. No glowing eyes. No shadows crossing the yard. Still, the call came again. Faint, stretched by distance, but unmistakable. A mountain lion. David shivered. A mountain lion moving through bobcat territory meant conflict. Willow's den collapse suddenly made far more sense. Large predators pushed smaller ones out by force, especially during scarce winter months. If the ATV tracks caused the collapse, the lion was likely the one that claimed the territory afterward. And if it had passed close enough to pick up a kitten, David turned away from the window, jaw tight. The sanctuary he built today might not be enough. A larger cat could track scent, hear movement, or follow a frightened kitten's cry. He had to act before the lion returned. But Willow shifted suddenly, lifting her head, ears rotating forward as she stared at the door. Something was outside. David froze. Willow let out a faint, low growl, not the violent, territorial kind, but soft, guttural, meant only for David's ears. Be careful. He approached the door slowly and pressed his ear to the wood. At first, all he heard was the wind, then another sound, something brushing against the porch boards, a rustle, light but intentional. He drew a deep breath and unlatched the door. When he pulled it open, snowflakes drifted inside like glittering dust. A cold gust swept into the cabin, and for a heartbeat, he feared he would see the golden eyes of a mountain lion staring back at him. But the shape on the porch wasn't a predator. It was a shredded, mud-covered backpack. David stared, confused. He stepped outside and nudged it with his boot. It was torn along one side as if ripped open by claws or dragged across sharp rocks. Snow had gathered inside the pockets. The straps were frayed. When he flipped it over, a name tag flashed beneath the porch light. "Jack," he read quietly. Jack, the man Ethan mentioned, the hunter from the lodge, the one who reported seeing something big. David swallowed hard. If Jack had dropped this out here, something must have chased him off. Something fast. Something unexpected. Something dangerous. And if that predator had driven him toward the ridge, it might have crossed paths with Willow's den at the exact wrong moment. David picked up the backpack and backed into the cabin, shutting the door behind him. He set it on the table and pushed aside the zippered pockets, searching for anything that might give a clue as to what Jack had been doing out here. Inside the largest pocket, he found a flashlight with dead batteries, a half-eaten protein bar, and a crumpled topographic map marked with red ink. The map showed the ridge behind David's land, and a spot circled in heavy red was labeled Tracks. Underneath, scribbled in messy handwriting, "Too big for Bobcat." David's pulse quickened as he traced the circle. Willow let out a soft cry. He turned immediately. She had managed to lift herself slightly and was looking toward the back door, the one that led to the newly built sanctuary. She nudged her kittens closer to her belly, then looked back at him again with urgency. She wanted to move them. Right now. "Okay," David whispered, grabbing blankets and gently arranging them around Willow. "We'll take them." He placed 2 kittens inside his jacket for warmth. Willow picked one up softly. David gathered the remaining 3 in a lined basket he used for firewood, layering it with warm cloth. Willow tried to stand, but her injured shoulder buckled. She steadied herself, trembling, then limped toward the door. "I've got you," David murmured, opening it carefully. Snow crunched beneath their steps as the 2 of them made their slow journey to the hidden sanctuary. Willow paused often, breathing hard, her legs shaking with every step, but she pushed on because her babies needed her to. When they reached the entrance to the new den, David set the basket down and cleared aside the pine boughs. Willow slipped inside first, sniffing the bedding, touching the walls with her whiskers. She approved. Then she turned back toward the entrance, her eyes meeting David's in a way that stopped him cold. This was her den now, her home, her second chance. David placed each kitten inside as gently as if they were made of glass. Willow immediately gathered them against her chest, curling around them in a tight crescent of fur. "Rest," he whispered. "You're safe here." Willow blinked slowly, accepting his words. But as David backed out and brushed snow away from the entrance, he noticed new tracks pressed into the fresh powder, large, deep prints leading through the brush. They weren't his, they weren't Willow's, and they weren't from a bobcat. He crouched, touched the edge of one print, and felt a cold dread settle in his chest. The mountain lion wasn't passing through. It was circling, watching, claiming. And now, it knew exactly where Willow and her newborns were hiding. David backed away from the sanctuary entrance, his heartbeat thundering in his ears as the cold air thickened around him. The tracks in the snow were too large, too deep, too fresh. They cut across the brush in slow, deliberate arcs, circling, pausing, circling again. A predator had been watching, studying, deciding, and in the stillness of the forest, David knew with an instinct older than language. The mountain lion believed this ridge belonged to it now. The Bitterroot Mountains were no stranger to such predators. But this was different. This wasn't a casual wanderer passing through. The tracks weren't meandering. They were patterned, territorial, a warning etched in snow. David cleared the sanctuary entrance as quietly as he could, brushing fresh snow over the tracks to mask the scent trail. Willow was inside with her kittens, her body curled protectively around them. He saw her golden eyes watching him from the darkness, still on alert, still wounded, still trusting him with everything she had left. He whispered through the narrow entrance, "Stay quiet. Stay hidden. I'll be back soon." Willow didn't move, didn't blink. She simply held his gaze until he stepped away and lowered the pine boughs back over the den, camouflaging it once more. David headed toward the cabin, every sense straining. Twice he stopped, convinced he heard something behind him, A soft crunch, a shift of weight, the muffled snap of a branch under heavy paws. But when he turned, nothing moved in the shadows. The forest held its breath. Back inside the cabin, David shut the door firmly and slid the latch into place. His hands trembled as he leaned against the doorframe. He knew the law as well as anyone. He'd spent years working alongside rangers and wildlife officers. He knew exactly where the legal lines were drawn, and he knew he had just crossed several of them. It was illegal to house, feed, or medically treat an adult bobcat without authorization. It was illegal to harbor wildlife that should be reported to the State Rehabilitation Center. And if the authorities found Willow and her kittens here, especially with a mountain lion in the area, they wouldn't hesitate to intervene. The kittens would be taken. Willow would be captured or relocated, and none of them would stay together. David felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He walked to the table and spread out Jack's torn backpack, the map, and the flashlight. Everything pointed to the same truth. A bigger predator had moved in. If he reported Willow now, help wouldn't arrive in time. The mountain lion would reach her first. His eyes drifted to the window, where thick snow blurred the line between forest and sky. Beyond it, Willow and her kittens were huddled in the den, relying on him in a way he had never imagined possible. David rubbed his hands over his face. He'd spent a lifetime respecting wildlife laws. He understood why they existed: to protect animals from human interference, not trap them in bureaucracy. But laws didn't understand Willow. Laws didn't understand that she had chosen him, that she had trusted him enough to bring him 6 newborns when the world was collapsing around her. He sat heavily at the table and whispered into the empty room. If I follow the rules, they'll die. If I break them, they might live. The choice wasn't a choice at all. As daylight faded, David made his rounds, checking windows, securing the door, stacking more wood by the fire. He boiled water, heated formula for emergencies, and laid out clean towels in case Willow needed help through the night. He worked silently, methodically, trying to quiet the fear gnawing at him with every passing minute. Near dusk, a soft knock at the door made him freeze. Not a predator, a human. David opened the door a crack and found Linda standing there, snow in her hair, her expression tight with worry. I saw fresh lion tracks on the ridge, she whispered. Closer to your place than they've ever been. You need to be careful. David hesitated, then stepped outside and closed the door behind him so she wouldn't hear the faint mews from inside. I know. Linda folded her gloved hands. Are you sheltering her, David? He swallowed hard. Sheltering who? Willow. Her voice softened. That's her name, isn't it? You told me years ago when you found her trapped in that old fence. David didn't speak. Linda exhaled. People in town are nervous. They think the bobcat and the lion are fighting over territory. They're talking about calling in wildlife control. It won't be long before someone does. David's pulse hammered. If they come up here, they'll take her. They won't take her, David, she said gently. They'll remove her, and the kittens too. Her words hit him like a blow. Linda reached out and squeezed his arm. I know you have a good heart, but you can't hide a bobcat family forever. Think carefully about this. With that, she turned and walked back down the snowy trail, her figure swallowed by the darkening woods. David closed the door and leaned his forehead against the wood. He could almost hear Willow breathing in the sanctuary behind the cabin. She wasn't his to protect. She wasn't his responsibility. And yet, she was. He'd made his decision the moment he carried the first kitten inside. He walked to the back door and opened it just enough to feel the cold air against his skin. The forest was pitch black, silent except for the faint whistle of wind weaving through the pines. Somewhere out there, the mountain lion watched. It had already circled the den once. It would do so again, tonight or tomorrow or the next day. David whispered into the dark, "You'll have to go through me first." Then he shut the door, turned the lock, and took his place by the window, keeping watch, breaking rules, and silently choosing the lives of a bobcat family over the laws written on paper. It was a choice he couldn't undo, and one that would cost him dearly in the days to come. The next morning arrived softly, the forest wrapped in a thick fog that muted every sound, turning the world outside the cabin into a pale, ghost-like haze. David stepped out cautiously, boots sinking into fresh snow as he scanned for any trace of the mountain lion. The prints from the night before had filled in slightly with new snowfall, but enough remained to confirm what he already knew. The predator had lingered nearby even after he'd returned inside. He followed the trail to the edge of the thicket, but no new tracks appeared beyond that point. The lion was gone, for now, but its message remained etched clearly in his mind. This wasn't a predator hunting for food. It was staking its claim over territory, pushing out smaller animals, including bobcats like Willow, and in doing so, it had nearly taken one of her kittens. David blew out a slow breath, the cold turning it into a swirling cloud as he turned back toward the cabin. He still had to check on Willow and her little ones. The sanctuary he built sat quietly behind the snow-covered trees, smoke from the cabin chimney drifting through the branches like a thin gray ribbon. It felt like a fragile bubble of safety inside a forest that was growing more dangerous with each passing hour. When he reached the den, he paused at the entrance and listened. No growls, no frantic cries, only a soft chorus of mews from inside, tiny squeaks muffled in warmth. When he lifted the pine boughs and looked in, he found Willow awake and alert, her golden eyes fixed on him, her kittens nestled tightly against her belly. Willow didn't growl or pull back. Instead, she watched him with a steady calm, a look that told him she understood what he'd done for her family, and trusted that he would continue doing it. "Morning, girl," David whispered, crouching near the entrance. "How are they doing?" One of the kittens, braver than the rest, lifted its small head and toddled forward on unsteady legs, right toward the edge of the den. Its paws sank into the wood chips, and it let out a curious squeak that made David smile. Willow nudged it gently back toward the others. Though she was exhausted, her instincts hadn't failed her. She was still teaching them, even in her weakened state. But something else caught David's attention. One of the kittens, the striped one, stared right at him, its tiny nose twitching. Then, with surprising boldness, it stepped toward him again, wobbling across its siblings until it reached the very edge of the den entrance. It was only a few inches from his hand now. David froze, not wanting to startle it. The kitten sniffed the air, then leaned forward until its cold, wet nose brushed the toe of his boot. Then it lifted its head and touched its tiny nose to the leather. It was such a small gesture, barely more than a tap, but it sent a warmth through David that rivaled the fire in his cabin. A wild bobcat kitten, fragile and barely a week old, showing curiosity instead of fear, trust instead of instinctive retreat. He whispered softly, "Well, aren't you a brave one?" Willow watched him closely, but didn't intervene. Instead, she lowered her head and rested it gently on her paws. It was as close to approval as he could hope for. David leaned back and took a slow breath, the weight of the previous night easing slightly. He'd spent the last few days reacting, building, searching, rescuing. But now, seeing the kittens alive, watching Willow teaching them even in the smallest ways, he realized something was shifting. Willow wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. She was beginning to rebuild. And the kittens, they were thriving despite everything. He stayed outside the den for several minutes, observing the family. The kittens explored their mother's fur, batting at her tail, crashing into each other with tiny squeals of protest. Willow tolerated it for a moment, before gently nudging them back into a pile. She was tired, but she was present. Still mothering. Still trying. That small, ordinary display of wild motherhood lit something inside David, a spark of hope that felt unfamiliar after the past few harrowing days. But when he finally rose to his feet, brushing the snow from his coat, another thought anchored itself deep in his chest. Hope didn't erase danger. He made his way back to the cabin and warmed his hands over the stove. Through the window, he watched the forest, searching for movement. He saw nothing but drifting snow. That didn't comfort him. The law required people like him to report injured wildlife, to surrender them to experts, to step back. And normally, he would. But reporting Willow now would mean uprooting a mother from her fragile young, shattering the trust she had given him, and placing her family into a system that didn't guarantee they'd stay together. He couldn't do that. Not after everything she had survived. A sharp knock jolted him out of his thoughts. He opened the door to find Ethan again, this time with a bag of tools slung over his shoulder and an uneasy look in his eyes. "Linda told me they're getting serious," Ethan said, brushing snow from his beard. "Couple of guys from town are planning to come up here with traps. They're talking about setting them along the ridge." David's face tightened. "They can't do that without a permit." Ethan shrugged grimly. "Since when has that ever stopped anybody?" David's pulse quickened. A trap wouldn't catch a mountain lion, not unless it was baited heavily, but it could easily maim Willow, or worse, injure one of the kittens if they wandered too far from the den. "We have to keep them safe," David said. "The lion isn't the only threat now." Ethan nodded. "What do you need me to do?" They spent the rest of the morning preparing. Ethan reinforced the sanctuary door with additional branches to help conceal the entrance. David placed small wind chimes made from spare metal scraps around the property, not loud enough to disturb wildlife, but soft enough to alert him if something large passed nearby. They walked the ridge together, brushing away tracks, covering prints, trying to erase any sign of a bobcat family. By the time Ethan left, David felt more prepared, but not at ease, not even close. Later that afternoon, as the sky turned a pale blue-gray, David returned to the sanctuary to check on Willow once more. Inside, the kittens had drifted into a warm bundle, their small breaths merging into a single, gentle hum. Willow glanced up when he arrived, her eyes softer than he had ever seen them. "You're strong," David whispered, "stronger than anything out there." Willow blinked slowly, a silent thank you, or perhaps reassurance. He knelt again and watched as the kittens stirred, climbing over each other in a sleepy tangle. Their tiny paws pressed against Willow's fur, their eyes barely open, their world no bigger than the den they lay in. No mountain lion could touch this moment. No fear or law or winter storm could steal it from them. Willow nudged them closer, curling her tail around them, her body forming a perfect crescent of love and instinct. David exhaled. Yes. They would learn. They would grow. Willow would teach them everything she knew: how to move silently, how to stay hidden, how to survive. These were lessons of the wild, and he would protect them long enough for Willow to teach them all. But danger still waited beyond the trees, and the next test would come sooner than he expected. The morning broke with a sharp, brittle cold that settled deep into the earth. Frost gathered on the window panes in delicate branches, and every breath David exhaled fogged the air like smoke. He stepped outside with caution, scanning the tree line for any disturbance. The world seemed still, but the stillness felt deceptive, like a silence stretched too thin, ready to snap. He walked to the sanctuary behind the cabin, brushing aside the pine boughs from the entrance. Inside, Willow lifted her head slowly. Her wound looked less inflamed, her eyes clearer, more focused. She had gained back slivers of strength, a mother rebuilding her reserves, ready to defend her young again. But something in her posture made David pause. She wasn't curled tightly around her kittens today. Instead, she sat upright, watching them with a gaze that felt deeper, almost reflective. The kittens tumbled over one another in clumsy, playful bursts, batting at Willow's tail, climbing onto her paws, nipping at each other with baby teeth still too small to do harm. Willow didn't stop them. She didn't nudge them back or pull them close. She let them play. It was the first time since they had arrived that she'd allowed any distance at all between herself and her babies. "You're feeling stronger," David murmured. Willow blinked, slow and deliberate. He knelt near the entrance and watched silently as the kittens began to mimic Willow's movements. When she stretched her front legs, they stretched too, some falling over in the attempt. When she turned her head sharply at a sound, they did the same, a clumsy chorus of instinct awakening inside them. The wild was calling them, even here, safe in a human-made den. Hours passed quietly. David darted back and forth between cabin and sanctuary, bringing fresh bedding, heating water for Willow, and watching the forest closely. But something in the air had shifted, and even he could feel it. The danger, for a moment, felt distant, overshadowed by something else unfolding between Willow and her kittens. Late in the afternoon, as a soft snowfall brushed the ridge, Willow rose unsteadily and nudged her kittens forward. At first, David thought she was moving them deeper into the den, but then she stepped toward the entrance and looked back at him. Not with fear, but with a calm he had never seen in her before. "You want to go out?" he whispered. Willow didn't move. She simply met his gaze, then turned her head toward the forest, her ears tilting toward distant sounds only she could hear. The kittens gathered at her feet, squeaking with excitement and confusion. David's breath caught in his throat. It was time. Not to leave permanently. No, they were still too small. But it was time for the first lesson all wild creatures must learn: how to walk beyond the walls that kept them safe. How to step into a world that belonged to them, not to a cabin or a human or even their mother's fur. Willow pushed the first kitten gently toward the entrance. It stumbled into the snow, squeaking at the cold, then, instinct kicking in, padded forward unsteadily. The others followed, each taking tentative steps into the winter light. Willow limped after them, placing herself at the rear, watching them closely. David stepped aside, giving them room. Willow paused beside him. For a moment their shoulders nearly brushed. She looked up at him, eyes steady, calm, and ancient in their depth. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pleading. It was gratitude. Unspoken. Undeniable. Willow led her kittens only a few yards away from the den, letting them explore the brush. They climbed over roots, pawed at pine needles, and tumbled down a small slope, tiny hunters in the making, guided by the quiet presence of their mother. She corrected them with soft growls, guided them away from shadows, nudged them gently when they strayed too far. David watched from the cabin steps with a tightness in his chest. It was beautiful. It was wild. It was everything he'd hoped for them. But woven into the beauty was something else, something that made his heart ache. Willow wasn't showing them the world. She was preparing them for it. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the snow in orange light, Willow gathered her kittens close. She led them back toward the sanctuary. The kittens followed eagerly until Willow stopped. Not at the entrance, but between David and the trees. She looked at her kittens, then at David, then toward the forest, and David's breath caught. "No," he whispered softly. "Not yet. They need you." Willow's ears twitched. She lowered her head and touched each kitten's face in turn. Then she lifted her gaze to David one more time. There was a message in that look, quiet, heavy, unmistakable. "You've helped them survive. Now they must grow." She nudged the kittens toward the sanctuary, pushing the last one gently with her nose. They tumbled inside, mewing in protest. She didn't follow. She backed away slowly, her paws sinking into the snow, her tail curling behind her in a final, lingering gesture. David took a step forward instinctively. "Willow, wait." She didn't run. She didn't turn. She simply walked, slow and steady, into the darkening forest, her silhouette growing smaller with each step, dissolving into the shadows of the pines. No drama. No fear. Just a quiet, chosen goodbye. The kittens cried faintly from the den, searching for her warmth. David knelt at the entrance, whispering soothing words, though he doubted they understood. He arranged more bedding around them, his hands shaking slightly. Inside the sanctuary, the kittens curled into one another, their tiny bodies forming a trembling pile of confusion, comfort, and instinct. Outside, the forest swallowed the last trace of Willow's tracks. David sat in the snow long after she disappeared, staring into the trees, fighting the tightness in his throat. He knew she would be back someday. He believed that. But tonight, she had chosen to return to her world, and chosen to leave her family in his care until they were strong enough to follow. He whispered into the cold air, "I'll protect them, I swear it." The wind carried his words into the trees, and somewhere out there, Willow listened. For 3 long weeks, winter deepened over the Bitterroot Mountains, laying heavy blankets of snow across the pine groves, freezing the creeks into glassy ribbons, and quieting almost every living sound that once echoed through the valley. It was a season of waiting, slow, cautious, breath-held waiting that wrapped itself around David's days and nights. He settled into a rhythm, one that felt both unfamiliar and strangely natural. Each morning, he woke before sunrise to check the sanctuary behind the cabin. Each evening, he braved the cold again, sometimes with only a lantern to guide him through the dark. And every time he lifted the pine boughs from the entrance, he found 6 growing bobcat kittens waiting for him. Eyes brighter, legs steadier, instincts sharper. They learned fast, faster than he expected. They stopped trembling in the snow and began testing their paws on the icy ground, pawing at fallen branches and chasing shadows. They started using their noses more, sniffing at scents drifting from the distant ridge. Some afternoons, they wrestled playfully, mimicking the motions of small hunters, crouching, pouncing, batting at invisible prey. Watching them made something in David's chest warm, an ache that felt like pride, mingled with bittersweet fear. Because as they grew stronger, one truth became clearer. They were no longer babies. They were becoming wild creatures, creatures who belonged to the mountains, not to him. But Willow did not return. Not in the morning. Not at dusk. Not in the black hours of night when David stood on the porch hoping to hear her soft tread in the snow. He checked for tracks every day. Some were from deer, some from foxes, and a few, larger, heavier, belonged to the mountain lion. But none were hers. He knew the shape of her prints by heart. The gentle inward curve of the toes, the subtle tilt, the narrowness that marked them as distinctly bobcat. They were gone, completely gone. On the 5th day, David told himself Willow was hunting. On the 9th, he told himself she was resting. By the 12th, he forced himself to believe she was reclaiming territory, reclaiming the life the collapse had stolen from her. But on the 17th day, standing in knee-deep snow with the lantern flickering against the tree trunks, he whispered into the silence, "Please come back. Just once. Let me know you're okay." The forest didn't answer. Yet the kittens kept growing, and that demanded his attention. They had begun climbing the side of the sanctuary, reaching the roof, then leaping into the snow below. They stalked each other through the brush, their movements clumsy but determined. They were bobcats, built for forests, not firelight. One late afternoon, as he crouched outside the den, the boldest kitten approached him again, the same one who had first touched his boot weeks ago. Its eyes were now a rich amber, reflecting the glow of the sinking sun. It stepped closer, sniffed his knee, and let out a soft, breathy chirp. David smiled faintly. "You're going to be just like her, aren't you?" The kitten blinked slowly, then bounded back to its siblings. As the shadows lengthened, David gathered what was left of the day's chores, bringing in more wood, clearing snow from the walkway, and checking the wind chimes he'd set around the property. They jingled softly in the breeze, just enough to warn him if anything large approached. That evening, while the cabin warmed, he stood by the window staring into the dark tree line. The sky was clear for once, revealing a scatter of stars that shimmered coldly above the ridge. The forest felt vast and endless, too large to search, too quiet to reveal any secrets. He whispered to the emptiness, "Willow, if you're out there, I hope you're safe." He turned away from the window, blowing out the lantern. The room dimmed, the fire crackled, and the kittens slept soundly in the sanctuary outside. Then, a sound. Soft, barely there. A rustle, a slow, careful step. Snow brushing against something moving just beyond the tree line. David's breath caught. He crossed the room, opened the door a crack, and stepped onto the porch. The cold bit sharply at his skin, but he didn't feel it. The forest was silent. Too silent. Then, between two pines, a shadow moved. Small. Low to the ground. Not the heavy gait of a mountain lion. Not the skitter of a fox. Something in between. The shape paused, listening, watching, measuring the distance between the trees and the cabin. David stepped forward, heart pounding. The shadow shifted, then emerged slowly into the thin silver light of the moon. Willow. She was thinner than before, her fur dusted with frost, her gait uneven but determined, her golden eyes, those same eyes that had watched him trustingly weeks ago, now glowed with something gentler, older, and infinitely tired. David swallowed hard. Willow. She didn't approach him. She didn't run. She simply stood at the edge of the clearing, watching him with a calm that felt almost ceremonial, like she had come not for food, not for safety, but for closure. His eyes drifted behind her, searching for small shapes following her pause. But none came. Willow was alone. She took one slow step forward, then another, then stopped halfway to the porch. Her breath puffed visibly in the moonlight. She lifted her head slightly, as if acknowledging him in the most bobcat way possible, without sound, without gesture, but with presence. David's throat tightened. "They're safe," he whispered. "Your babies are safe. They're growing strong. You did everything right." Willow blinked. Long, slow, deliberate. Then she turned her head toward the forest one last time, the muscles in her body moving with the quiet grace of a creature reclaiming its place in the world. When she looked back at David, the moment stretched between them like a thread pulled taut, a silent exchange of gratitude, trust, and goodbye. And then, without a sound, Willow stepped backward into the shadows. Not running, not hiding, just returning. As she vanished among the trees, the wind shifted, carrying the lingering scent of pine and cold, and something indescribably wild. David closed his eyes. He didn't call out to her. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. She had come back, not to stay, but to show him she had survived. Inside the sanctuary, the kittens slept on, oblivious to the quiet reunion outside their walls, stronger now, brighter, ready for the spring thaw that would soon carry them toward the life they were born to live. David stepped back inside the cabin and shut the door gently behind him, the faintest smile softening the ache in his chest. He whispered into the warmth, "Thank you, Willow." Outside, the forest accepted her back without a sound, and in the hush of that winter night, David felt a peace settle over him, a peace shaped by survival, trust, and the soft echo of a goodbye chosen freely. Willow was gone, but her legacy, 6 tiny lives, remained, and they would carry her wild heart into the world long after the snow melted. If you felt even a little something while watching this journey, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop a simple 1 or even 0 in the comments, anything, to let me know you're here, still rooting for Willow's little family. And if you'd like to follow the next chapter of their story, make sure you subscribe, hit that notification bell, and stay with me. There are more moments ahead, quiet ones, wild ones, healing ones, and I'd be honored to share every one of them with you. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story.